So, rapid application part 2 for lesson 2, and let us move forward. So, lots of little objectives for this lesson. Looks like we're going to talk about how we use text boxes and group boxes and check boxes and all this other stuff. Different controls that we're going to throw onto our form. We're going to drag and drop it again. We are going to set the border style property to change the controls to make them appear flat or three-dimensional. There's all kinds of little controls. We're going to focus on the properties section of the when we do our form manipulation here in our UI and C#. Right? We're going to talk about that a lot. You're going to get to know the toolbox, right? The toolbar, if you will. You're going to get to know that really, really well in Visual Studio because that's where you're going to drag and drop your controls. You're also going to really get to know your properties sidebar, where you're going to actually modify your properties for your for each of the controls. All right. So. You're also going to we're going to learn how to make controls visible and invisible. All these things are very, very straightforward. If you actually look through the properties on Visual Studio, and let's just take a look at that. So here's Visual Studio again. I'm going to create a new project, and I'm going to call it, lesson 2. And you can call it whatever you like. I'm going to call it practice, right, for lesson 2. Here's a great opportunity for an aside. Right? If you look, I have this wonderful option here that you guys don't have that says create new Git repository. Do you see this? Right here on the bottom of my screen here. Oop. How did I get it? Right? We're going to talk about that in a second. I'm going to say no for now, and I'm going to go into my lesson 2 practice. If I say yes, it will activate my Git repository, which I don't really need to do for this practice session, and press OK. How did I get it, and where does it come from? We'll talk about that in a second. If your Visual Studio starts off like this, if you notice my toolbox right now is kind of hidden, right? It's kind of folded over here on the side of my interface. If I click onto it, it'll come up, and I can actually pin it to my interface with this little pin here, right? So if you guys haven't done that before, here it is. So now it's pinned to my interface. Now it's always going to be here if I want to. And again, you could switch between this. You're going to have opportunities, for example, for data sources, where you can switch between data sources in your toolbar. If I pin this up too, I can actually switch between data sources down here or my toolbox. I can also unpin it. You can customize your interface the way you like. Okay, so here's my toolbox. But how did I get this Git functionality into my Visual Studio? Well, there's sections where you can download your different extensions and updates that you can go to. If you go to Tools, Extensions and Updates, and if I go to here, right, I've kind of downloaded and installed a bunch of little tools that are free, because they're, again, free and open source. There's one called Visual Studio Tools for Git, right? If you go to that one, you can download that, and that'll connect you, very easily, as long as you have a Git account, a GitHub account. If you follow the steps, it'll actually create or attach Git functionality to your Visual Studio. And if you want to, you can upload your files. Every time you do a change, you can create a commit, and from there you can upload your files up to GitHub through Visual Studio right here. Right. So this is where I actually got the download. You can download this from, again, right through Tools, Extensions, and Updates. Okay, and you can disable it and install it. You can do all this stuff. I've also added other things into my Visual Studio just because I felt like playing, and so I downloaded other extensions that I thought were cool. I'm probably not going to use a lot of these in the course. One extension you probably will be using that is not showing up here. I wonder if it's up here. Is this extension that we're going to be able to connect to. We're going to be connecting with the MySQL kind of a database. There's tools for that as well that are free. And if you ever want an extension, you can go online if they don't exist, if you want to search, right? And if I want to search for MySQL, and I'm looking online here, I can just go, MySQL. I want to find a tool for MySQL. I look through it, and it's going to give you some different options for MySQL. For example, .connect Express for MySQL. We're going to get to that later on in the course. You can download this. It's a free extension completely for Visual Studio. There's other ones that are a paid-for extension. And be wary because they don't tell you that they expire, right? But most of these are trials that expire in like 30 days, right? So, but there are some that are free. For example, this .Connect Express is definitely free, and you're going to need that for later on. All right, so that's how I got it, and you can activate it and play with it. I haven't activated it here. We'll try it later on today. I'll show you how to use Git and how to upload your files to GitHub as you go after you do a commit. Okay, so we've got our form here, and if you notice, just to recap from last week, for those of you who didn't have a chance to look at it very closely, we have our toolbox, and here normally, if you notice, all Windows forms are available. Maybe you want to kind of filter this to common controls, which is probably the stuff we're going to probably use instead of all controls. It's up to you how you organize yourself, of course. But to me, if I want to drag and drop something onto my interface, I just go to button, and I just really just pull it into my interface, and I can create my interface button by button, control by control. And the right here, this property is what we're really going to attack today because it allows us to do different things with both the controls and the forms. Okay, so that's what we're going to be focusing on in here. And also, the other thing we're going to focus on is resources. How do I access resources that are from my application itself? There's an actual resource folder that gets created in different sections when we activate the resources, and I'll show you how to do that through the project menu. Okay, but we'll get to that later on. Okay, so this is what we're really kind of doing today. Let's go back. So let's talk about more controls. Okay, so again, we've got lots of controls, and if you look up online, I've given you, by the way, all of these code examples on there. You can look through them all. I think they're helpful for you from an understanding perspective. If you don't know how to do something that we've talked about, you can always go through it. But I recommend, again, don't do it until we've talked about it in class, until you've practiced it here, until you failed at doing it first, and you can't figure it out. Then you go and take a look at the examples. I have every confidence, though, that chances are you're not going to have any issues, and that's good. I'm okay with that. All right. So here's some examples of text boxes that you've seen before in other kinds of programming. And if you notice, there's this text align property that you can align it the way you want. You can also do it in code, where you say, and right here at the bottom, it says message text box dot text align is equal to horizontal alignment dot left. Okay, how does that work? So if I go back to Visual Studio as an example, and I drop in a text box, so here's a text box, right? And as an example, you can actually go to the text align, right? And if you look, it's left, right, center, or whatever. But if I want to, if I double-click on my form, when I load my form, I can do that too, right? So I haven't really named my text box anything different right now. It's just text 1, I believe. So if I look through text box 1, text box 1, right? Here it is. If I've named it properly, and I haven't, because of course I made a mistake typing, because I'm a lazy typer. Text box 1, here it is, dot, right? And if it's the right element, if it's not, it won't allow me to do it, right? Text box itself is the object. Text box 1 is what it should be. And if it's not going to give me the right name. So let's go back and see what I bloody named it. Right? Oh, lower text. And by the way, hey, Andrew mentioned to me that we're practicing upper camel case, and for the C# standards are, just camel case, right? So lowercase, lowercase letter on the first part of your control, and then the second part is the camel's hump. That's okay, right? If you use Pascal case or upper camel case or some kind of standard way of doing stuff, you know what? Yes, for C#, this case where it's a lowercase t and an uppercase b, that's fine. And I'm going to be okay with you getting both. Because remember, we're translating the course from one to the other, so I'm not going to expect you to do it one way or the other. As long as you're consistent in your variable naming conventions, that's what's important to me. Okay? Now, the right way is, a lowercase t, like it says here, and an uppercase b, and that's fine. So let's go back to our code. Let's change. That's why it didn't connect with that. so lowercase, and we're going to change that anyway, right? So here's text box, and I click onto it, and then our text line is where we're going to type, and then I put equals, and if you notice, right, automatically, and this is where where IntelliSense comes in for Microsoft Visual Studio, it comes up with a suggestion. Don't discount this suggestion because you're not going to be able to remember what you need to do, right? So unless you're really you work a lot with Visual Studio and C#. So it's suggesting a horizontal alignment, which is really what I want. So if I enter that and then use my dot accessor, I can choose left, and that'll happen when the form loads. Because if you notice, this is the form load event, right? So when the form loads, I'm going to do stuff to this this text box. And remember, we're in C#, so we have to put a semicolon. All right, so back to the form. So when the form loads, I'm going to get horizontal alignment left. That's what this thing does. All right. Mass text boxes. You know what? An old practice. I know you might see this some places in certain other apps. I personally don't use these a lot. I'll be honest with you. I think there's way better ways of validating your user's input. And this is, to me, an ugly way. This is an old, ugly way of doing it. So not saying that, I don't expect you to do it, but validation has many cool ways. There's way better ways of doing validation, way nicer user experience than a mass test box, right? So who thinks that this is the right way to do it? I mean, I'm not saying, even though I've discounted it now. I mean, if you really like it.
I did it this way because I didn't know there was a better way.
Damn. Yeah, there are, better ways.
But yeah,
at the end of the way, I mean, for me, I hate when I have to enter, from a user experience perspective, we're talking from that side. If I start entering my digits, let's say they're asking for my phone number. When on the web have you ever had to follow this masked format, or even in an app these days? Never, right? Because they've got better ways. It's a better user experience. This is a poor user experience. I don't recommend it, but it's there for you to use. Mass test boxes. So you can. Sometimes there's a place for these things. There is a place for this control, but it's ugly. All right, and I'm not going to demonstrate it. Okay, rich text boxes. Another really, there's some functionality here where you can add in different coding, and it can actually allows you to use the another file that allows you to format what's inside the text box if you want to. Again. Not a lot of call for this in regular forms unless you're doing some kind of start screen where you want to create some kind of, you want to place in there an external document file of text. But rich text boxes is a great place to use when you want to swap out language, as an example, right? So you might have a language file for English, right? And the English language file might have all the stuff, all your inputs and everything for English, and rich text boxes are a great way of doing that. Using other language files, pulling files in, as opposed to hard coding them inside your text box itself, right? So that's another thing that you can do with rich text boxes that you can't do normally. This environment.uline character is used in the code, and we're going to just zero in on the code, for example. Now, for me to do this, I'm going to go back to Visual Studio, and I'm going to close off my solution, right? And yes, do I want to see the following changes? Sure. I'm going to reopen my project I'm going to go to my rich text boxes file that I've got here, and I'm going to open this up so you can see what we're doing. I really care about the code, and this is where it is right here in the code, if you notice, and mine's really, really big for the screen, and I've done it for you guys so you can see it on the video. So again, the code is called title rich text box.text, and if you notice, what am I doing here? I'm using the plus operator to concatenate strings. Have you seen this before somewhere, guys? All right, this is not rocket science. This is like you've seen it. Please don't use the ampersand. That's what the VB side uses, right? Ampersand will not work. It's plus. Okay. Is this a great way of doing strings and string format, string interpolation? No, I don't think so. I think it's better for you to use the format functionality of the string, because remember, even though there's a string object here, once you start doing quotations in C#, because everything is an object in C#, pretty much most things, right? There's a few exceptions. Once you start doing quotations, anything in the quotation is considered a string object automatically. And when it's an object, what can you do? Anybody? Use methods. That's right. Anything if I create a string object, so example, if I was going to just do a new line here, and if I was going to say, I don't know, my variable, and it's going to complain, is equal to, my string, right? Here's my string. And if I put a dot here, all of a sudden, IntelliSense will say, well, what do you want to do, Tom? Right? Here's the stuff that you can do with, because it's a string object, right? So I can do anything that I can do with that I would normally do with a string object itself, a variable, I can do with my string in quotations. One of the things, of course, would be my format, right? If I want to format my string, that's the stuff that I can do with my string. We'll get to string formatting later on, and we'll talk about how we can do that properly. Okay. But string formatting is really, really important. We'll talk about that. But for this, so this is not a very great way of doing it, these plus operators. But what they do is they concatenate the strings together. And in this rich text box, the other thing it does is it uses this environment.uline object here. So it basically gives you a space inside the text object itself. The other thing that we did was here is we used this simple rich text box. We load a file. This is the load file command. It's a very, very simple way of loading a file. And we're loading in this RTF, this rich text file, from your document, your project files. But where does this RTF have to be in order for you to use it? Anybody? If I'm loading in an RTF file or any kind of any file, yeah?
It's got to be held locally where this project is being.
Where is it? Yeah, it's not so easy. I would agree with you. It sounds simple, but that's where where kind of it ends. Let's go to full screen mode for a second, and I'll show you where it doesn't make a lot of sense. So here's full screen mode. Let's go to so it's not exactly what you think it would be. Here's Visual Studio, and here's projects. Oh, actually, I have a link here too. Rich text boxes. I go to here. It's not here, right? So it's not in the same. It's not where I think it should be. If I go to bin, like you said, there's debug and release. Debug, right? Because that's where I'm going to run things. And sure enough, there's my RTF, right? So it's important that you put your files where Visual Studio can find them. This is one ugly way of doing it. But you can also use resources. Yeah. Absolutely, right. And in the olden days, when we didn't have visual anything, right, you would have to have it somewhere where it's, you're going to take all your files, and remember, when we used to make our project, we used to build it, and then after we built it, we would, it would compile properly with all the components we would need, and then we could run it. All right, so we'd have to compile it first, and we could run the compiled version of our code. Here, Microsoft allows us to do all that for us. It's all in the background. It does a lot of things that we don't see going on. We could also turn that on. You can turn your log on so you can see what's going on, how it's building and everything else, if you want to. But most programmers, they kind of leave that, especially if they're doing rapid application development, they leave that kind of functionality off. So that's what's happening here, where it all comes from. Let me just go back to, we'll go back to Unity mode for a second. All right. And so really, that's what this rich text box does. It allows us to interpolate text and data from outside sources and format them. And if you look at the actual code itself, so now this is the code. Here's what the text box looks like. And if we actually click on this control, and if we go down, you notice that the lines that we're getting is a string array. This is very interesting. And if I click on this, it shows that it's empty because, of course, we're loading information into it at runtime, right? However, we could, in this section here, if we click on the ellipses that I showed you, it does allow us to go in there and actually create a string array of information that you hard code here into the UI. Not a great practice, though. Okay, but you could do it at a pinch if you had to. Okay, what other things we've done here for this form? The other thing for the form that we've done is we've actually changed the form itself, and we'll talk about that coming up. But let's just go back to the presentation and make sure we cover everything. Group boxes. The great thing about a group box is that when you put similar controls in there, for example, these radio buttons, right? Radio buttons, the way it works is if they're inside of a group box, the group box itself has a name, right? It allows us to, when one is checked, it kind of makes it exclusive to that group, so it unchecks the other ones automatically if you put them inside the group box. If they're alone, they can be checked and unchecked separately. You can have several different group boxes that allow you to group similar controls together. Check boxes is another example. And check boxes also allow you to do multiple options checked, as opposed to just only one option checked, right? So now one thing you could do also is if when this is checked, you could gray out the other ones. Like for example, you only give the user one choice. So make a choice, user, right? And then when you've chosen your selection, you've grayed out the other ones. So you disable the other, if you wanted to, disable the other radio buttons. It's brutal, yeah, I know. And then you can reset your form. As an example, you can create a reset button that resets the form and unlocks everything again. But the great thing is, each of these selections, if I select black as an example, it still creates an event listener. Because once we do any kind of clicking on the form, it creates an event gets triggered that we have an opportunity to listen and respond to. All right. Now let's just, before we break, one more minute. And here's the checkbox as an example. The checkbox gives us an opportunity again to, it gives us properties that are checked, true or false. And in C#, true is lowercase, just to remind you guys. In VB, you know, it's uppercase, an uppercase T. And you'll notice that if you go to the Visual Studio environment, it'll show you that there's an error if you try and put true or false in capitals. Lowercase, yeah. It won't allow you to do.
I was wondering if there was some sort of semantic difference between them.
There isn't. This is what C# requires from a syntax perspective. Okay, let's pause the recording here, and then we'll come back in about 10 or 15 after you guys have had coffee and wake up, because I'm glazing you guys over as I see. All right.